Hi everybody, I'm Adam Steele and this is the Logic Pro Basics 101 video. This is where we get the most recent version of Logic Pro and we take a look at how to get started right from the very beginning, and we're going to go through everything from using an audio interface, which I highly recommend, recording audio, manipulating audio a little bit, getting MIDI working, and finding your way around the absolute kind of start beginner level. We will do more intermediate and advanced things in later videos, but this one really is walking you right the way through everything you might need to get started if you've never used this, or maybe even any other digital audio workstation or DAW before. This is Hop Pole Studios, and this is my studio. I usually use a software called Reaper, that's kind of my favorite thing, but I also use Pro Tools, Cubase, and Logic, depending on where I go and what I'm doing. So I'm showing you everything that I can help you with to get you started. If you are interested in using Reaper, I did a full ultimate kind of guide to Reaper using the Pro Mix Academy platform. The link is down in the description below if you want to check that out. That's kind of the sponsor section of the video. We don't have an external sponsor, it's just me. So there you go. Without further ado, let's begin. So there are some things you're going to need. One of them is a Mac, because Logic doesn't work on PC, it is Mac only. Let's not talk about Hackintoshy stuff. If you're doing that, that's your own business, so let's just assume you're actually on a Mac. I highly recommend that you have some kind of audio interface. In this case, I'm using the Audient ID44 Mark II. Very nice interface, 4 analog inputs, loads of outputs, lots of features that could be really useful for you. But that's also fairly expensive. You might want to get something more like this. This is the ID4. This is the old ID4 Mark I with 1 microphone input, and this is far more stripped down and also far more affordable. There are going to be affiliate links down in the description for if you need anything like that, and that also helps us out. The other thing that I suggest that you might get if you're going to be working with external plugins and fancy processing is one of these things. This is an iLok. It's a little dongle that plugs into your Mac that will allow you to use the licenses for a lot of external stuff. You don't necessarily need one of these, but you might find pretty quickly that you could do with one. So just a good heads up now. I'm using this with the old USB-A, the kind of square-ended one, into an Anchor dock, which is plugged into one of the USB-C ports on my Mac. You can also get a USB-A to C cheaper adapter, or you can use now a USB-C version of the iLok. Same with the cables for interfaces. I'm using a dock, but I'm also using a straight USB-C cable into the ID44. First thing you're going to want to do is get Logic, and there is a 90-day free trial at apple.com, in my case /UK/Logic Pro/trial. If that page doesn't work for you, just Google Logic Pro trial and it will come up with this from the Apple website. So I have downloaded this. I'm going to click that and get that installed. Basically just hit yes, yes, agree, yes, probably going to want my password. There we go. All right, that's now installed. At this point, I can move that installer to the bin. And also, before I open Logic, I highly recommend you go and get the drivers for any audio interface that you might have. In my case, for Audient, that's audient.com. And I'm looking at the products, I'm looking for ID44 in the menu, finding the downloads, and of course, getting the latest macOS drivers. A lot of people say, oh, well, everything just works with a Mac. Not so. Not if you need the specific latest and greatest software that makes your Mac talk to your interface in the most efficient way with no dropouts, clicks, bugs, problems. Get the latest version of those drivers downloaded and installed. There's Logic Pro, let's get that opened up. Now, I would highly suggest you click complete mode here because there's no sense in walling things off for yourself. It's good to know where everything is, but simplified mode is kind of like GarageBand, and I would personally much rather have a far more comprehensive setup so that I can find things when I need to find them. Because you might be surprised how when you go from beginner level to even intermediate, you start asking questions about, where's this thing? How do I do this thing? How do I do that thing? And then if you Google it and it's not there because you're in simplified mode, that might be quite annoying. So this is now downloading the essential sounds. It's going to take a little while, probably because it's the trial version, and we'll have it detect all of my plugins as well, my external plugins that I have bought, which you might not need, but if that's the case and it scans through that, that's going to take a significant amount of time. So just expect that when you first install it, it's going to take a while. I'll see you back here in a second. Alright, so all the plugins and all that kind of stuff has been done, and now it's telling me the Logic trial will end after 90 days. Yes, okay. And so now I'm going to make an empty project and hit choose and make sure this gets opened. And so it's by default telling me you need an audio track type. I'm going to hit cancel on this and we're going to come back to that in just a minute. It won't let me do that, so I'm just going to add an audio track and just hit create. So there's something in there, but again, we'll come back to that in just a minute. Logic is open and now we need it to use this interface, and we also need it to be set to all the correct settings, sample rate and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go to Logic Pro, settings, and start with general. Everything in here looks good. Let's go over to audio and change the output and input devices. In this case, from MacBook Air speakers to Audience ID 44, which means this is now using this interface. Hit apply, and we should hear a nice chunk sound as everything springs into action. That can now be closed, and now we need to go to the project settings. That's under File, Project Settings, General. No, and here we want to go to Audio, and there is a choice of sample rate. Sample rate is important. If you're running at 44.1 kilohertz, that's usually what CDs used to use. 48 kilohertz is a whole different thing, but that's what TV and film and usually a lot of YouTube and other kind of video destinations use. So I'm going to use that. There are also higher and slightly more exotic choices you can use. I'm going to be doing a video on 96 kilohertz at some point soon, but don't worry about that if you're just starting out. I tend to choose 48 here and leave everything else as is. There are options for like spatial audio, but again, as a beginner, I wouldn't worry about that so much. I can now close that and now go, importantly, and save my work. I'm going to go to File and Save As, find a place where I want this to be, and I'm going to call this Logic 101. Organize it as a package, everything as is, and hit save. And now we have a project that is essentially ready to go. Now, the first thing I'm going to do before I actually look at recording stuff is find a track that already exists. Let's say it's a karaoke track, a backing track, some kind of track, and get that into Logic and get that playing back. So in this big blank space here, I'm going to right click and go to New Audio Track. And in this case, I'm going to call this Backing Track by double clicking where it said Audio 2, and that gives me an option to change its name. Now this, where the numbers are, where you see 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, that's the transport bar. And if we click around there, that is moving where this is going to play from. As a general rule, I don't like having projects that start right away. I like to have a little bit of a gap. Just in case you ever want to add an intro or something like that, it's good to have that little gap. So at this point, I'm going to want to insert a file. And to do this, I want to go to File, Import, Audio File. And then I can go and find my audio file wherever that is. In my case, it's in my Dropbox, so stand by just a second. And I'm going to use this particular track that was made by my friend John Brown and me. And if I zoom in and out, I can zoom in and out on my trackpad using 2 fingers. Nice little shortcut there. If you look top right, there is also a slider for that. But if I click the time over to the middle of this song, I should be able to hit play and hear this. So there we are, and now the big slider on here is the volume for that particular track, so I can take that down a little bit. Word of warning, before you do this, if you haven't done it yet, do make sure that on your interface your volume is turned down a little bit so you don't blast your speakers out on first go, because that will come out full volume, and if your speakers are at full volume and your interface is at full volume, that could damage something, so just be careful. Same with headphones. Make sure they're not at absolute full volume. You might find yourself throwing your headphones off because they're far too loud. So, on to adding our own recordings. So, if I was to right click here and go new audio track, that brings me up a new audio track. Now I'm going to delete audio 1, which was made by default because this is just confusing. So now I've got backing track and one called audio 3, which I'm just going to call bass input. I usually record a microphone at this point in these tutorials, but today, just to be a little different, I'm going to grab a bass guitar and plug that in instead. Okay, so I've got a bass. I've plugged it into channel 1 on the interface, and this particular channel here, if we look on the left, the input is set to input 1 on the interface. And there are loads of different inputs, but the one I've chosen here is the one that we want to hear. Now, we can see meters go. I've got my volume turned up, but we don't hear anything. That's because we need to monitor the input. And there are 2 ways to do that. One of them is through Logic, and the other one is usually direct through your interface. So in this case, next to the little R on the bass input here, which is record enable, we need that to be on so that when we hit record, this one is the one that gets recorded. But next to it is input monitoring, which is I. We click that and that goes yellow. And now we can hear that. And that's fantastic. Does have a very slight bit of what we call latency on it. Tiny little bit of a delay as it goes through Logic. If that's an issue for us at any point, we can turn off that input monitoring and we can go to whatever app came with our interface. In this case for audience, it's their ID mixer. And if I play, you can see that come up on the left-hand side, and I need to then turn up the fader there. So that is now giving us a near zero latency version of that. But any effects that we want to use, virtual amps, EQs, compressors, all that fancy stuff, we won't hear it using this method. And also, if you're hearing a weird kind of doubling chorusy effect on whatever the sound is that you're trying to listen to, it's more than likely that you've got both of these methods on at the same time, and one's coming in slightly before the other, which is causing that weird sound. So you need to decide which one is most appropriate for you and turn off the other one. In this case, I'm going to turn off the ID monitoring and turn on Logic's monitoring. So now I can go to any point on this song, and if I hit record, that will play back the backing track and not record over it because that's not record enabled, and it will record the bass. So there we go. I've now got a bass part. If I move over to past this track, just so you can hear an example, this is where the metronome can come in because I had a track to play to. If I didn't have a track to play to or I needed to keep in time, I would need to turn on this button up here, which is a metronome. And when I hit play, we get that tick, 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 tick sound. Of course, that's metronome. And the whole song currently is based on a tempo right in the middle here of 120 beats per minute. Most DAWs seem to start with 120 because it's a nice, easy 2 beats per second. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 with actual time. But if I want to change that to be faster or slower, I can drag that around, or I can just add a different number in there. It does seem to mess around with the previous audio, so do be careful with that. There are more tutorials on getting clever with audio manipulation and tempo, but for now, let's keep it basic. Now if I was to record, I can hear and that click helps me stay in time. Okay, now we've done some stuff with audio. We'll get onto audio more in a few minutes, but first we'll talk about MIDI. This is a keyboard that just appeared out of nowhere. This is a controller keyboard that makes MIDI happen. Now, it's worth noting at this point, this is not a piano that makes its own noise. This is just a controller keyboard. And what this keyboard does is send messages. MIDI messages are literally just a message that says I hit a note, how hard I hit it, and that note is now on. And then when I let go, it sends another message that says that has disappeared. That's pretty much it. There are extras like the pitch bend wheel and pedals and all that kind of, some of them, these keyboards have extra knobs and things, but it doesn't actually make any sound. So what we're going to do is we're going to get that data into Logic and then tell Logic what we want to do with that. This is a USB MIDI keyboard, so I quit Logic, plugged this in, and then opened up Logic again to make sure that worked properly. Quite often you'll see something like an old digital piano that has MIDI out on those kind of round 5-pin MIDI connections. Those would go into something like this. This is a Motu USB to MIDI box. And so this would connect by MIDI to the Mac, and then you would plug your MIDI keyboard into this, and then you would make sure that whichever port you plugged it into is the one you selected in Logic, and that would then send that MIDI data through to Logic exactly like this would without the middleman. So what I want to do is in this blank space here, right click and have a new software instruments track. In this case, it's come up with a classic electric piano, but where on the left here it says E-piano, I can click on the up and down arrow and I can choose any one of these instruments or anything even further down with the AU instruments. If I bought anything separately, they would all be in those kind of lists down there. But let's say I wanted a vintage B3 organ, and that's stereo. Now that is pretty much up and running, and I think if I do this, that is working. And what's happening here is if I just close this window down, the record enable came on by default on that. If I turn that off, no sound. Although a cool little function of Logic is at the top here. If I play a chord, it tells me at the top what that chord is, which is really nice to know that it can pick that up straight away. So I could play, say, an F minor. I could play, that's an E flat. That's a C minor, which I've now made whatever the chord is at the top, it'll tell me what I'm playing. But by record enabling this track, I can now have whatever that sound was. And then if I hit record with the metronome, two, and stop. And now I've recorded in some MIDI. And as you can see, if I zoom in on this, it doesn't look like the big block like the audio file did. It looks like tiny little blocks of notes. Now, if I double click that to open it, you can see at the bottom here, all the notes that I played. They're different colors depending on how hard I hit them. You can see there's a little mistake that I made down here where I can click that note and just delete it. Now if I hit play, that little clang of a note is gone. And again, there's another little clang over there, which I can click and delete. If any of these notes aren't long enough, I can make them longer by dragging them. I can move them around. I can manipulate them in any way I like. Really useful to know, so that if you're playing with a MIDI keyboard, or even if you're programming this in and clicking with the trackpad or a mouse to add more notes in, which I think you can do. Command and click adds another note, so I can just add as many notes in there as I like. And so I can add and embellish a part, and then I can have a completely empty MIDI part and literally add them in with a trackpad note by note, should I want to do it that way if I don't have a quick way of doing it. Now, let's go back to the audio for a second. This bass and this track that I've got here, let's say that I only want to hear one of them. Let's say that I'm playing and I don't want to hear the bass anymore. If we look at bass input over here, there is M and S. M and S are important. M is mute. And if you click that on any given track, that will turn that track off. Nice and simple. Next to it is S for solo, which is the opposite. If I click that, that mutes every other track temporarily, just so I can hear only solo this. Okay, so we're starting to get sounds there, but what if I want to change that sound? What if I want to affect it with, say, an EQ or a compressor or something like that? Now, an EQ in Logic is quite easy. If I click on, say, bass here and click on the left, the EQ panel, that brings up Logic's own EQ. So I can start adding, say, more low end, bit more high end, bit less in the mid range. And I can really mess around with that as needed. And that then goes in as an insert. Now, the difference between inserts and sends is very important when we're talking about effects. On the left here, this has made itself known as an insert. And the way that inserts work is we've got our files that are on the playback here. And when we hit play, they go from that file through any effects that are inserted. They're inserted in between that and what we hear out of the speakers. So if I have, say, a compressor, so if I go into dynamics, compressor, mono, that has now been inserted on the left here after the EQ, because it happens that in the way that inserts work, they always go from the top down and they go one after the other after the other. There we go. So I've played with the settings of this a little bit, and now the bass is being properly compressed after that EQ. And of course, if I need to change any of those settings again, I can click on the track. Those two come up on the left, and I can then just click once in the middle of that effect, and that'll bring up its window with all its own settings. Now, if I wanted to hear a section over and over, then that would mean that I would want to snap. So what I'm going to do is on this bar at the top, where it's got the numbers 77 to 81, that kind of thing, I'm going to drag a little kind of golden box, and you can see that's made a golden line there. And now loop is on the play button at the top. There's play, record, and then there is loop. If I play this now, when it gets to the end of that, it should go back and play that over and over and over and over for me. And you may have seen that just went back then. If I turn off loop mode, another trick that I can do in Logic that's really cool is if I click on this MIDI item, if I want that to play for the rest of the song, I can hit L for loop. the L button, and that will just repeat that over and over and over and over, even though I can then change other things in the arrangement as that goes. That's probably saved me quite a bit of time right there. All of this has been really useful so far in terms of building up a track, but when we get to changing levels and adding effects and sends and that kind of thing, it will be much easier for us if we show the mixer, which is the X key of View and Show Mixer. And that shows this, which looks a bit more like an analog mixing desk. We've got the faders for volume, we've got things like our effects that we can see in here, we've got sends, which I'm going to talk about now. So I've got 3 different tracks. I've got our organ, I've got the backing track, and I've got the bass. What if I wanted them all to go to a separate reverb, which is something that's very common in mixing? That way I can have a single reverb and not a ton of them. I can have one set of controls that affects everything, and then I can add a little bit or a lot of each thing to the reverb as I see fit. So to make something like a reverb, which did automatically get made when we made our organ, but we're going to do it ourselves manually, I have opened the mixer window, and let's say the bass input, I'm going to send this in this send section here. I'm just going to click in this open bit and go to a bus, and I'm going to send this to bus 4, just because it's the next one that hasn't been used. And so now that's being sent to a kind of a golden track called aux 3. And so now I'm going to add into there a reverb. Let's use silver verb. And so we've now got a reverb, and I'm going to double click where it says aux 3 at the bottom and call that verb. So now we've got a reverb, and let's say that it's already set how we like it, how we want it to sound. And so now, if I hide the mixer for a second and hide that as well, we should be able to see now we're not hearing anything from the reverb just yet because we have to get our send, and next to it is a little circle. We have to click that and drag that up to turn that up. When I hit send now on our bass part, we should hear a whole ton of reverb. And now I can do the same thing by adding another send to bus 4 on our organ there, and exactly the same bus 4 on our backing track. And so now they all have some reverb, and I can change those levels how I like. They are tiny little things, but at the top here is sends on faders. I can turn that on briefly and choose one, and then I can use these faders for the amount of reverb that I've got on each track, and then turn that off because that's just a viewing thing. That turning that off doesn't turn the reverb off. That just changes back to how we were supposed to see it, and now the faders affect the overall volume of each track. Now, sometimes we want to edit and start these and stop these exactly on the beat, exactly on the grid. And by default, that's on. If we look at snap at the top here, that is set to smart snap, which, depending on how zoomed in you are, will decide whether you should go right to the bar or whether it should be the beats in between. And you can be quite specific with it. But if I don't want to use the grid for a little while, I can turn that off right there. And so now I can get into editing audio. I'm just going to drag this so it's a little bigger so you can see it. Let's say this kind of silent bit here was actually me fidgeting and I didn't really want that. I can hover over the left side of this big block of wave and I can drag that in. Same with the right hand side, I can drag that in or drag it out so you can see which bits are there and which bits are not playing. Now, if I want to cut this, there's a little arrow in the middle here which I can drop down and change the tool. So it's currently on pointer, I can make that scissors and I can cut the audio as I like and then change it back to the pointer and then either change exactly where that cut is Or if I just select the one piece of audio, I could probably take the bottom there, yeah, and just trim the middle out. So now that won't play that middle bit. That's cut, and we'll come back in a second. And that's how I clean up things like vocal edits. If there are coughs, splutters in the middle, I can cut bits out, and then that makes my life so much easier. And also, if I want this to fade in, I can drag this, edit it, and from the top of the audio file, I can go to the fade tool, and then from there, I can drag in a fade from the end or the start of the track. And you can see how that's brought these lines in. And now those, when I hit play, have given me a much more gentle fade in and fade out. So the splitting, trimming, fading can make your editing life much easier. And so there you go. I think those are most of the basics that you would need to get going. Editing in Logic, recording audio, recording MIDI, and editing it to make it sound halfway decent. There is a lot more to learn, of course, and there are intermediate and advanced tutorials out there. I'm working on some myself. So hope you enjoyed this. Thanks everybody for watching, and a big thanks to our patrons on Patreon, which really helps to support us do videos like this. Your names are on screen right now. If you're looking at Reaper, check out the Ultimate Reaper Guide. Stick around on the channel for stuff about mixing, because I'm a mix engineer by trade, and with different DAWs, things like different microphones, production techniques, there's all sorts of stuff on here. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.